New Year's Eve had always been an excuse for reckless dares. For Marcus and Ian, it was no different. The town's stories about the old asylum on Elm Ridge had been passed around for decades. Silhouettes glimpsed in windows, piercing screams cutting through the dead of night, and the faint, mocking laughter of children. Everyone knew someone who'd sworn the place was alive with malevolence, but no one dared to step inside until now. The building loomed on the hill like a jagged scar against the skyline. Years of abandonment had left it weathered and broken, its skeletal remains barely holding against the weight of time. The once white exterior was now stained with streaks of rust and moss, the windows gaping like hollowed eyes. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, its no trespassing signs fluttering weakly in the winter wind. For Marcus and Ian, this was a challenge too good to resist. The walk to the asylum was quieter than they'd expected. The usual buzz of New Year's celebrations, fireworks, laughter, drunken songs, felt muffled, as if swallowed by the dense woods surrounding the path. Ian kept glancing over his shoulder, brushing it off as paranoia when he thought he saw movement. Marcus, always the braver of the two, pushed them forward, undeterred. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. The night air felt heavier the closer they got to the building, thick with an unnatural stillness. The world seemed to shrink, every sound amplified. The crunch of boots on frozen dirt, the faint whistle of wind through barren branches, the occasional rustle from the shadows. When they reached the fence, a sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, sending a cascade of dead leaves skittering across the ground. Marcus climbed over without hesitation, but Ian hesitated for just a second too long. As he hoisted himself up, he swore he felt eyes burning into his back. From beyond the fence, the asylum loomed even larger, its silhouette jagged against the starless sky. Inside, Marcus motioned for Ian to follow, and with a deep breath, they stepped into the darkened threshold. The temperature dropped instantly. The air inside felt damp, the smell of mildew mixed with something metallic. Somewhere deeper in the building, there was a faint, rhythmic creak, like footsteps falling on a distant floorboard. It was too faint to follow but too deliberate to ignore. Their flashlights flickered as they moved through the main hallway, the beams barely piercing the oppressive dark. On the peeling walls, faint, scrawled words appeared beneath years of grime, too faded to read but ominous in their presence. As the wind outside died down, the silence inside became suffocating, broken only by faint, indecipherable whispers. And that was when they noticed the first shadow. The shadow flickered at the edge of the flashlight beam, darting across the hallway faster than either of them could process. Marcus and Ian froze, their breath catching in their throats. For a long, agonizing moment, they stood there, straining their ears against the thick silence, waiting for another sign of movement. But nothing came. Marcus waved his flashlight around, illuminating the cracked tiles and water-stained walls. The air smelled stale, tinged with decay. The only sound now was the faint drip of water somewhere above them, its rhythmic plink echoing through the corridor. Ian's unease began to spread. It wasn't just the dark, or the stories, or even the strange flicker of movement. It was the way the place seemed to breathe around them, how the darkness wasn't just empty but filled with something watching, waiting. The whispers grew louder, though still impossible to pinpoint. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, like echoes of voices long silenced. The two of them pressed on, deeper into the asylum. The long corridor was lined with doorways, each leading into empty rooms stripped bare of furniture. Paint peeled from the walls in long, jagged strips, exposing rotting wood and rusted metal. Here and there, graffiti marred the surfaces. Crude faces, jagged symbols, and words that seemed like nonsense at first glance. But the farther they walked, the more the graffiti seemed to align, forming phrases that were unsettlingly clear. Leave. They see you. You don't belong. The writing grew more frantic, the letters uneven and clawed into the walls as if by desperate hands. The corridor ended at a heavy metal door, its surface pitted with rust. A faded sign above it read, "Basement Access." Marcus didn't hesitate. He pulled it open with a groan of protesting hinges. The smell hit them immediately, a rank, sour odor that clung to their nostrils. The staircase spiraled down into darkness. Their flashlights barely illuminated the bottom, but it was enough to see that the concrete walls were damp, streaked with long trails of black that resembled the aftermath of a fire. The whispers seemed louder here, almost buzzing, though they still couldn't catch the words. Every step down felt heavier, as if the air was thickening around them, pressing down on their chests. When they reached the basement, the cold was unbearable. Their breath puffed out in faint clouds as they stepped into the wide, open space. This room was different from the upper floors. It was filled with remnants of equipment. Rusted gurneys, shattered glass jars, and metal tools splayed across the floor. Chains hung from the ceiling, their ends swaying gently as if recently disturbed. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly behind them. They spun around, their flashlights slicing through the dark. There was nothing there. The room behind them was empty, silent except for the faint hum of whispers. But now the whispers had a rhythm, a cadence, almost as though they were chanting. And then, from the far corner of the room, came the first scream. The scream tore through the air like a jagged blade, high-pitched and desperate, its source impossible to locate. Marcus and Ian staggered back, their flashlights whipping around wildly, illuminating only the empty, decaying expanse of the basement. The sound bounced off the concrete walls, distorting and warping until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. The whispers had ceased too, leaving the basement unnervingly still. Marcus tightened his grip on his flashlight, the beam trembling slightly as he scanned the room. Ian was rooted in place, his breathing shallow and rapid, his body screaming for him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. And then they saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a pale form barely distinguishable from the gloom. It stood at the far end of the room, half hidden behind an overturned gurney. Marcus aimed his flashlight at it, but the beam seemed to falter, dimming as it passed over the figure. The thing was tall, unnaturally so, with a thin, angular frame that seemed barely capable of supporting its weight. Its skin was sickly pale, almost translucent, stretched taut over its elongated limbs. But it was the eyes, or lack thereof, that sent a wave of cold dread through them. The creature's face was disturbingly smooth, devoid of features except for two sunken pits where eyes should have been. Those voids seemed to suck in the light, leaving nothing but an empty, soulless gaze. It didn't move. Not yet. Marcus and Ian stood frozen, their flashlights trained on the thing. It was hunched slightly, its long arms dangling almost to the floor. The silence dragged on, stretching the tension to an unbearable breaking point. And then, without warning, the creature twitched. It was a subtle motion, a small jerk of its head as if it had just noticed them. Slowly, it straightened to its full height, its bony form unfolding like a grotesque marionette. Its head tilted to one side, almost curiously, and it took a single, deliberate step forward. The sound of its movement was wrong. The scrape of its foot against the concrete was sharp, metallic, as though its body was made of something other than flesh and bone. The chains hanging from the ceiling rattled softly, swaying as if disturbed by a breeze that didn't exist. And then the whispers returned, louder and more insistent, like a chorus of voices rising from the walls themselves. This time, Marcus and Ian could make out words, though they were fragmented and layered over one another. Leave. Not yours. Never safe. Gone too far. The creature took another step. The panic hit them both at once, primal and overwhelming. Marcus turned on instinct, grabbing Ian's arm and yanking him toward the staircase. Their boots pounded against the floor as they fled, the beam of Marcus's flashlight swinging wildly as he ran. Behind them, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as though whatever haunted the asylum was furious at their intrusion. And over the cacophony of voices, they could hear it. The scrape of the creature's steps, slow and deliberate, following them into the dark. Their boots clanged against the rusted stairs as they scrambled upward, the flashlight beams bobbing erratically. The oppressive darkness seemed alive, clinging to their skin like a suffocating fog. Marcus didn't dare look back. He could hear Ian panting behind him, his breaths ragged and uneven. But over that sound came something worse. The steady, deliberate scrape of footsteps from below. It was following them. The whispers were a deafening roar now, filling the stairwell with overlapping voices. Some pleaded, some mocked, and others growled in a language neither of them could understand. The air grew thicker, colder, as if the asylum itself was closing in around them. Each step felt harder to take, as though the stairs were pulling them down, fighting their escape. When they reached the top, Marcus slammed the door shut behind them. The sound echoed through the corridor, momentarily drowning out the whispers. Ian leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath, but Marcus didn't give him a chance to rest. He grabbed Ian by the arm, pulling him down the hallway. "We have to keep moving," Marcus thought, though the words never reached his lips. His mind was racing, instincts screaming at him to find an exit, to get as far away from this place as possible. The flashlight beam jittered across the walls, briefly illuminating more of the disturbing graffiti. The phrases they'd seen earlier now seemed to shift and change before their eyes, the words twisting into new, even more sinister messages. "It sees you. No escape. You are theirs." The temperature continued to drop, their breaths forming thick clouds in the frigid air. The long hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the doors to the empty rooms blurring together. But then something caught Marcus's eye, a movement just ahead, near the junction where the hallway split into two. A shadow. It wasn't like the faint, flickering shapes they'd seen earlier. This one was solid, defined, and it moved with purpose. It slid across the wall, heading toward the left corridor before disappearing into the darkness. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, his grip on Ian tightening as his mind raced. Then came the scream. It wasn't like the first one they'd heard in the basement. This scream was shrill and agonizing, as if it were being torn from someone's throat. It came from the right corridor, echoing through the empty halls and filling every corner with its gut-wrenching sound. Marcus and Ian froze, paralyzed by the sheer horror of it. But the sound behind them snapped them back into motion. The door to the basement had creaked open, and from the stairwell came the faint clinking of chains. The thing was coming. Without thinking, Marcus pulled Ian toward the left corridor, chasing the shadow they'd seen moments before. It was their only option, anywhere but back to the basement. The left corridor was narrower, the walls closing in like a suffocating tunnel. The flashlight beams seemed weaker here, their light swallowed by the oppressive dark. The whispers had returned, fainter now but still present, crawling along the edges of their hearing. The floor beneath them felt unstable, creaking ominously with each step. And then they saw it, a door at the end of the corridor. It stood out from the others, slightly ajar, with a faint, flickering light spilling from within. It wasn't the cold, sterile glow of their flashlights but something warmer, almost inviting, like candlelight. Marcus didn't trust it, but they had no choice. Behind them, the sound of chains grew louder, accompanied by the scrape of something dragging across the floor. The creature was close, and it wasn't alone. The door at the end of the corridor seemed impossibly far, the flickering light within casting strange shadows that danced on the walls. Marcus and Ian ran, their boots pounding against the uneven floor, their breath coming in harsh gasps. The sound of chains and dragging footsteps behind them grew louder, the things closing in. The whispers had changed again, morphing into a guttural chant. It was rhythmic and primal, each syllable vibrating through the walls and into their bones. The words were still incomprehensible, but their intent was clear. They weren't meant to leave. As they reached the door, Marcus shoved it open, nearly stumbling into the room beyond. Ian followed, slamming it shut behind them and throwing his weight against it. They stood there for a moment, both of them gasping for air, their ears straining for any sign of pursuit. But the hallway had gone silent. The sudden absence of sound was almost worse than the whispers and screams. It felt deliberate, like the calm before a storm. Marcus's flashlight flickered, casting uneven light around the room. It wasn't what they'd expected. The space was small, almost claustrophobic, and unlike the rest of the asylum, it was eerily clean. The walls were a dull beige, free of graffiti or grime, and the floor was tiled with pristine white squares. At the center of the room stood a single wooden table, and on it sat a candle, its flame sputtering faintly. But it was what surrounded the table that made their blood run cold. Dozens of photographs were pinned to the walls, their glossy surfaces reflecting the flickering candlelight. Each photo was of a different person, their faces caught in moments of terror. Some were screaming, others crying, and a few had expressions of blank, vacant horror. The edges of the photographs were frayed, as if they'd been handled too many times. On the table next to the candle sat an old Polaroid camera, its lens cracked but still intact. A stack of fresh film rested beside it, along with a small brass key. Ian's flashlight beam landed on a single photo pinned directly above the table. His stomach dropped as he recognized it immediately. It was a picture of him taken just moments ago. The photo showed him in the hallway outside, frozen in terror as he looked over his shoulder. The detail was impossibly clear, right down to the sweat glistening on his forehead. Marcus followed Ian's gaze and spotted another photo beside it, this one of himself. It was just as sharp, capturing the moment he had turned toward the door. The photos couldn't exist. They hadn't seen or heard anyone take them, but the evidence was undeniable. Suddenly, the door rattled violently, as if something was throwing its full weight against it. The wood groaned, splinters cracking at the edges. The whispers were back, louder now, rising into a cacophony. The thing or things were right outside. Marcus grabbed the key from the table, his mind racing. There had to be another way out, another door, a hatch, something. He scanned the room frantically, but the walls were bare except for the photographs. The only other exit was a small, metal grate in the corner, barely large enough to crawl through. The door rattled again, harder this time. Whatever was on the other side was relentless, and the flimsy wood wasn't going to hold much longer. The door splintered under the next impact, the wood cracking at its edges as the thing outside pressed harder, its chains clinking in a rhythm that matched the whispers. Marcus and Ian's panic hit a fever pitch as they realized they were trapped. The metal grate in the corner was their only hope. Marcus dropped to his knees and inspected it, his trembling hands fumbling with the screws that anchored it to the floor. The brass key he'd grabbed from the table was too large for the screws, but he jammed it against one anyway, scraping frantically at the corroded metal. Ian hovered behind him, flashlight aimed at the door. It rattled violently again, the crack widening. Through the jagged opening, he could just make out something pale and thin moving in the darkness. The whispers surged in volume, now almost indistinguishable from screams, filling the small room with a suffocating noise. Finally, Marcus wrenched the first screw loose, flinging it aside. "Hurry!" Ian hissed, though his voice was drowned out by the rising chaos. The second screw came loose more easily, and Marcus yanked at the grate, pulling it free with a metallic screech. The hole beneath the grate was dark and narrow, barely wide enough for a grown man to fit through. A cold, damp draft wafted up from below, carrying the faint smell of rot. Marcus didn't hesitate. He shoved the flashlight into his jacket and slid into the opening, his shoulders scraping against the sides as he disappeared into the darkness. Ian hesitated for only a second, long enough for the door to give another sickening groan. The splintering would finally give way, the door bursting inward as something impossibly long and thin slithered into the room. Ian didn't turn to look. He could feel its presence, a cold, unrelenting malice that made his skin crawl. He dove into the hole, pulling the grate in behind him as much as he could before sliding into the pitch-black tunnel. The creature didn't give chase immediately. Instead, there was a soft, deliberate scraping noise, like nails dragging along the floor above them. Then came a sound that turned Ian's stomach, a faint, slow laugh, low and guttural, reverberating through the walls. The tunnel stretched downward at an angle, slick with moisture and lined with jagged concrete. Marcus was ahead, his labored breaths echoing in the confined space as he wriggled through the darkness. Ian followed close behind, his movements frantic, the panic in his chest growing with each inch forward. The whispers hadn't stopped. They seemed to seep into the tunnel, following them, growing louder the farther they crawled. Ian could swear the walls were closing in, the rough edges snagging at his clothes and skin. The air was damp and cold, and the faint smell of rot grew stronger with every breath. After what felt like an eternity, Marcus's flashlight beam reappeared, illuminating a small, open chamber at the end of the tunnel. He scrambled out and turned to pull Ian up, the two of them collapsing onto the damp floor. They sat there for a moment, gasping for air, the whispers still faintly audible in the distance. The chamber was circular, its walls covered in strange, swirling symbols carved deep into the stone. The floor was uneven, scattered with broken shards of glass and something that looked disturbingly like old, rusted medical instruments. In the center of the room stood another door, metal with heavy bolts and no visible keyhole. Marcus pulled the brass key from his pocket, staring at it in confusion. It didn't match the door, but there was nothing else to use it on. His flashlight beam scanned the walls, searching for some other clue, when Ian froze. The laughter had returned. It echoed through the tunnel behind them, faint at first but growing louder, closer. It wasn't alone this time. Other voices joined it, rising in pitch, their tones somewhere between mocking and predatory. The chains were back too, clinking softly in the distance. And then the scrape began again, slow and deliberate, dragging closer with each second. The laughter and scraping echoed louder, reverberating off the chamber walls. Marcus and Ian scrambled to their feet, their flashlights sweeping frantically across the room. The whispers in the air were no longer faint. They were oppressive, surrounding them in a suffocating cacophony that made it impossible to think. The door in the center of the room was their only chance. Marcus gripped the brass key tightly, even though it didn't match the lockless door. His mind raced for another solution, searching for some hidden mechanism or clue among the strange symbols etched into the walls. But the carvings seemed to move in the flickering light, their swirling patterns shifting like living things. Behind them, the laughter stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse. Ian turned toward the tunnel they'd crawled through, his flashlight aimed into the darkness. He could hear the faint rattle of chains, the scrape of something sharp dragging against the stone walls. Whatever was coming, it was close. Too close. Marcus shouted Ian's name, though the sound was lost in the whispers. He grabbed Ian's shoulder and pulled him toward the door. It was heavy, its surface cold and slick with condensation. Marcus pressed against it with all his strength, but it didn't budge. He slid the brass key into the gap between the door and its frame, prying at the edges desperately. That was when Ian noticed the shadows. They crept along the edges of the chamber, slithering up the walls and pooling on the floor. At first, they were faint, like the natural shadows cast by their flashlights. But they grew darker, deeper, until they were pitch black and unnaturally sharp. The shadows didn't behave like normal ones. They moved independently, coiling and writhing as if alive. Ian tried to shout a warning, but his throat seized. The air had grown impossibly cold, and a pressure settled over him, like an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. He stumbled back, his flashlight beam shaking as it darted from wall to wall. The shadows weren't just creeping anymore. They were converging, slithering toward the center of the room, toward them. Marcus gave a final heave against the door, and it shifted slightly. He wedged the key deeper, using it as a lever, but his strength was failing. The scraping noise from the tunnel was deafening now, joined by the heavy clink of chains. Whatever had been hunting them was almost here. And then they saw it. The creature from the basement emerged from the tunnel, its grotesque form illuminated by their trembling flashlights. It was even taller than they remembered, its long, emaciated limbs stretched unnaturally. The chains that dangled from its skeletal frame rattled softly as it stepped into the room. Its eyeless face turned toward them, the hollow pits seeming to drink in the light. Behind it, more figures crawled from the tunnel. They were smaller, their forms twisted and malformed, dragging themselves forward with unnatural jerks and spasms. Their movements were erratic, their pale, featureless faces tilting at impossible angles as they scrambled into the chamber. Marcus screamed as the door gave way, swinging inward with a groan of protesting metal. He grabbed Ian and shoved him through the opening, following close behind. The two of them tumbled into the darkness beyond, the sound of chains and scraping metal following them. Marcus slammed the door shut, throwing his weight against it as Ian fumbled to find something to secure it. The whispers surged, now louder than ever, their voices angry and relentless. Marcus held the door with all his strength, but it shuddered violently as the creatures outside began to pound against it. Then, for the first time, one of the whispers became clear. A single voice rose above the rest, low and guttural, echoing through the room. "You shouldn't have come." The door buckled under the weight of the pounding, the metal groaning with each impact. Marcus leaned against it with all his strength, but the vibrations reverberated through his body, a chilling reminder of the relentless force on the other side. Ian scrambled in the darkness, his flashlight beam darting wildly, searching for something, anything, to secure the door. The chamber they had stumbled into was even darker than the last, the walls slick with moisture and covered in deep gouges. The air felt heavier here, suffused with a damp, metallic tang that clung to their throats. Marcus's flashlight revealed more strange carvings on the walls, but these were different. Unlike the swirling patterns they'd seen earlier, these marks were jagged and chaotic, as if they'd been scratched into the stone in a frenzy. The pounding on the door ceased suddenly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Marcus and Ian froze, their breathing ragged as they listened. For a moment, all they could hear was the faint drip of water from somewhere deep within the chamber. And then, the voice returned. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a deep, guttural growl, reverberating through the stone walls. "You can't hide." The words were slow, deliberate, each syllable dripping with malice. Ian's flashlight beam landed on a rusted metal bar lying on the floor. He grabbed it and jammed it into the door's frame, wedging it tight. It wouldn't hold for long, but it was better than nothing. Marcus stumbled back, his flashlight swinging around the room. That's when they noticed the markings on the floor. The gouges formed a rough circle in the center of the chamber, surrounding what appeared to be a trapdoor. The edges of the circle were littered with bones, small and brittle, their surfaces cracked with age. The faint smell of rot intensified as they approached, the trapdoor seeming to pulse faintly in the flickering flashlight beams. From behind the door, the sound of chains resumed, accompanied by the unmistakable scrape of nails on metal. Whatever was out there hadn't left. It was waiting, watching. Marcus gestured toward the trapdoor, his mind racing. It was their only way forward. The brass key still clutched in his hand seemed absurdly out of place, but he knelt by the trapdoor, searching for a lock. There wasn't one. Instead, the wooden surface was carved with more symbols, their jagged edges glowing faintly as if in response to his touch. Ian knelt beside him, his hands shaking as he traced the carvings with his flashlight. The symbols pulsed brighter, the glow spreading across the trapdoor in a network of faint lines. And then the voices returned, not whispers, but a single unified chant. The door behind them shuddered violently, the creatures throwing their full weight against it. The rusted bar bent with a horrible screech, its edges digging into the frame. Marcus slammed his palm against the trapdoor, desperate. The glow intensified, spreading up his arms, cold and electric, as if the door was alive. The trapdoor clicked. With a final groan, it swung inward, revealing a yawning void below. A blast of cold air rushed up, carrying with it a nauseating stench that made them both recoil. The darkness beyond the opening was absolute, but there was no time to hesitate. Marcus dropped into the hole, his flashlight clattering down with him, the beam spinning wildly. Ian followed, the sound of the creatures breaching the door ringing in his ears as he disappeared into the darkness. They fell for longer than they should have. The air whipped past them, growing colder with every second, and the voices followed them into the void. But now the whispers sounded amused, like the faint echoes of mocking laughter. Marcus hit the ground first, his body jarring against the hard stone. His flashlight beam flickering weakly as it landed a few feet away. Ian landed beside him with a thud, groaning as he rolled onto his back. Above them, the trapdoor slammed shut with a deafening boom, plunging them into total silence. The silence in the abyss was absolute. Marcus and Ian lay on the cold, unforgiving stone, their bodies aching from the fall. The air was thick and still, so oppressive it felt like it might crush them if they stayed still too long. Ian's flashlight had gone out completely in the impact, leaving Marcus's flickering beam as their only source of light. It barely penetrated the darkness, the beam weak and unsteady, as if the blackness itself was consuming it. Marcus struggled to his feet, the pain in his knees and palms sharp and immediate. He retrieved his flashlight, its beam swinging across the cavernous space they had landed in. It wasn't a room, it was something much older, much deeper. The walls weren't concrete anymore. They were rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture and crawling with veins of black that seemed to pulse faintly, like exposed arteries. Ian groaned, pushing himself upright. His breath came in short, uneven bursts as he glanced around, his face pale in the dim light. The faint smell of rot that had plagued them earlier was overpowering here, mingled with an earthy, metallic tang that coated their tongues and filled their lungs. It was the smell of something ancient, something that had been sealed away for centuries. The floor beneath them was uneven, scattered with debris. Splintered wood, shards of glass, and rusted metal fragments that looked suspiciously like tools. But there were also bones. Too many bones. Some were small, splintered beyond recognition, while others were longer, more intact, their curved edges unmistakably human. The flashlight beam landed on an archway carved into the far wall, its surface engraved with symbols similar to those on the trapdoor above. These carvings weren't glowing now, but their jagged lines seemed to writhe in the shifting light. Beyond the archway was another corridor, its interior shrouded in the same impenetrable blackness. Behind them, the faint whispers returned. They weren't close, but they were there, lingering at the edges of hearing like an unshakable shadow. Ian turned toward Marcus, his expression one of pure dread, but neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Their path forward was clear. There was nowhere else to go. They moved toward the archway, their steps slow and deliberate, the sound of their boots crunching against bone and stone echoing through the cavern. The corridor beyond was narrow, the walls pressing in tightly on either side. The deeper they went, the colder it became, their breath forming visible puffs in the frigid air. The chanting began again. It started faintly, a single voice humming a low, mournful tune. But as they moved deeper, more voices joined in, growing louder and more discordant with each step. The sound came from everywhere at once, surrounding them, filling the narrow corridor like a rising tide. The voices spoke in that same guttural language, the words incomprehensible but their meaning unmistakable. They were being watched. The corridor opened into another chamber, this one larger than the first. In its center stood a grotesque altar, constructed from uneven stone blocks that jutted out at unnatural angles. The surface of the altar was stained dark, the color indistinguishable in the dim light but unmistakably old. Around it were more symbols, carved deeply into the floor in a spiraling pattern. The chanting reached a fever pitch as they approached the altar, the air vibrating with the intensity of the sound. Marcus's flashlight began to flicker wildly, and Ian's hands shook as he tried to restart his own. The darkness pressed in on them, heavy and suffocating, as if it were alive. And then the altar began to move. The stones shifted, grinding against one another with a deafening screech. The spiral symbols on the floor lit up in an otherworldly glow, casting the chamber in an eerie, pulsating light. Marcus and Ian stumbled back as the altar split open, revealing a gaping hole that seemed to descend into infinity. From within the hole came a sound, a deep, guttural growl that wasn't like the whispers or the chanting. It was primal, raw, and filled with a hatred so intense it made their skin crawl. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the sound of something massive shifting in the depths below. Marcus grabbed Ian's arm, his flashlight shaking as he aimed it toward the opening. What emerged defied explanation. It was vast, its form twisting and shifting as if it couldn't decide on a shape. Pale, fleshy tendrils reached out from the hole, their surfaces glistening in the eerie light. Eyes, hundreds of them, unblinking and soulless, opened along its writhing surface, fixing on Marcus and Ian with a hunger that transcended anything they'd ever felt. The whispers turned to screams, the voices echoing in their heads, driving spikes of pain through their skulls. The creature pulled itself farther from the hole, its form growing larger, more grotesque as it rose. The chamber trembled, the walls cracking under the force of its presence. Ian fell to his knees, clutching his head as blood began to drip from his nose. Marcus stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the ground. The last thing he saw before the light went out was the creature lunging forward, its tendrils spreading wide to engulf them both. The darkness consumed everything.